On the 8th of April, 2026, the President of the United States signed an order to release the alien files. Within a month, there was a government website with a name out of a spy novel, Pursue, and on its first real day, it took something like 340 million hits. A caucus of congressmen demanded more. A respected physicist went on the record with a number, 4. 4 recovered non-human species, he said. Not craft, species. If you only arrived in 2026, it looked like the sky was finally opening. If you had been watching a little longer, something else happened when you looked closely at the documents. A cold, specific disappointment.
It was the same material. I'd seen most of it before. Different letterhead, a few new redactions lifted, but the same stories, moving through the same kinds of people. And I kept thinking, I know this shape. I've been staring at this shape for years.
This is James Carrion. Before he spent a decade taking apart the history of the flying saucer, he had 2 other jobs. He was a signals intelligence analyst for the United States Army, a professional reader of other people's secret traffic. And from 2006 to 2010, he ran the largest civilian UFO organization in the world. So when the files came out in 2026 and felt familiar, he did not reach for the word he was supposed to reach for. He did not say cover-up. He said something more precise and much older.
Gardening. It's a codebreaker's word. And once you've seen it, you can't stop seeing it.
To understand why a spy would call a flying saucer gardening, we have to go back, past 2026, past the Cold War, past the very first flying saucer. Because the machine that manufactures what a nation believes is older than the thing we're trying to explain. Before there was a phenomenon, there was already deception. In the winter and spring of 1896 and 1897, the United States looked up and saw airships, great cigar-shaped craft with brilliant searchlights, drifting over Sacramento, over Omaha, over 1,000 small towns. They were reported by sheriffs and preachers and farmers. They were completely, gloriously real to the people who saw them, and they did not exist. There were no airships in 1897. The technology to build what people described would not arrive for years. What existed instead was a country newly wired together by the telegraph, a hungry and competitive press, and an appetite for wonder. A single vivid story, filed to the wire, could bloom overnight in 100 papers, each editor adding a little, none of them lying exactly, all of them feeding the same growing thing. A sky full of craft, made almost entirely of ink, and at its edge, a small, perfect fable. In April of 1897, the town of Aurora, Texas, a place the railroad had passed by, a place quietly dying, reported that one of the airships had struck a windmill and crashed, and that the pilot, a being not of this world, was buried in the local cemetery. The story was filed by a local stringer, a part-time correspondent named Hayden, and Aurora, briefly, was on the map again. A dying town, a real estate motive, and a spaceship that salted the ground with mystery for the next 100 years. Researchers would still be digging in that cemetery in the 20th century.
That's the whole grammar of it, right there in 1897. Somebody with a reason seeds a story. The medium amplifies it, because amplification is what the medium does. And 100 years later, people are still holding shovels. Nobody had to keep the lie alive. The lie was self-sustaining. You just had to plant it.
Seed, amplify, and let belief do the rest. Hold on to those words. We are going to watch them operate for the next 75 years. And the only thing that will change is who is holding the shovel and what they are burying. Now, before we go any further, this series owes you an honest account of how it will argue. Because the subject is a minefield of bad reasoning, and we are not going to add to it. We are borrowing a tool from the world Carrion came from, the intelligence world. It is called the analysis of competing hypotheses. The idea is almost aggressively simple. You do not fall in love with one explanation and defend it. You lay out every explanation that could account for the evidence, the boring ones and the sinister ones side by side, and then you spend your energy trying to knock each one down. The explanation left standing is the one that survived the most attempts to kill it.
The mundane explanation gets a seat at the table every single time. Bureaucratic sloppiness, coincidence, people being greedy or lazy or wrong. If a boring explanation can account for the facts, the boring explanation wins until it can't. My job is not to prove a conspiracy. My job is to see which story the evidence refuses to let go of.
So everything in this series carries a flag. When a thing is confessed, or proven in court, or sitting in a declassified file, we will tell you it is documented, and we will say it plainly. When the evidence points two ways, we will call it contested, and we will give you both readings. When we are making an inference, a reasonable one, but an inference, we will call it a hypothesis, out loud, and treat it as something still on trial. And when the evidence breaks one of our own favorite stories, we will retire it on the air. We are going to do exactly that later this season to the strongest form of Carrion's own idea. You will watch him argue himself out of his best material. When that happens, trust the thread a little more. June 1942, the Pacific. The United States Navy is about to fight the most important battle of its war at a place called Midway, and it has a secret it cannot afford to reveal. It is reading Japanese naval code. The code breakers know an attack is coming. What they do not know for certain is the target. The Japanese refer to it only by a two-letter designator, AF. So the Americans set a trap, not for a fleet, but for a word. They have the garrison at Midway send a message, in the clear, that they know the Japanese can intercept. The island's water distillation plant has broken down. Midway is short of water. And they wait. Days later, Japanese naval traffic reports that AF is short of water. The Japanese had just told the Americans, in their own supposedly unbreakable code, exactly where they were going. AF was Midway. That maneuver, deliberately staging an event of known content so the enemy will transmit that content in cipher, handing you a matched pair of plain text and code, has a name. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park called it gardening. You plant something, you wait for it to come up, and when it does, it gives you the key to everything else in the field.
That's the word. That's the one. Gardening is not a metaphor I invented for a podcast. It is a working term of art in signals intelligence, and it describes a real, repeatable technique. You make the enemy encrypt something you already know. And once you can match the known thing to the encrypted thing, you're inside.
Now hold that in one hand, and in the other, take this. January 1944. Two Allied officers fly into Moscow through freezing weather. One of them is an American named William Baumer, an architect of the great D-Day deception plan. Their mission is to coordinate that deception with the Soviets, then still allies against Hitler. And at a table in a place called Karl Marx Place, the conversation turns to newspapers. The British and American officers say something to their Soviet hosts almost with pride. There is one thing a democracy will not do. It will not use its own free press to fool its own people. And the Soviet general just looks at them. "Oh," he says, "we do that all the time." The Americans weren't posturing. 2 years earlier, in 1942, after a run of deception mishaps, the British and the Americans had made it policy, a written rule, that the Allied press would not be used for deception, off limits, and the Soviets believed them. From then on, they dealt with the Western Allies on the assumption that American newspapers, whatever else they were not a weapon. Hold on to that because it is the hinge of everything that follows. A rule your enemy trusts you to keep is the most valuable thing a deceiver can own. It makes a clean channel, a newspaper the other side reads as honest. Break that rule quietly, just once, at the right moment, and you would be planting in the one field your adversary had no reason to guard. And the record suggests that in peacetime, in 1947, that rule was quietly set aside.
So here's what we have before a single flying saucer exists. We have a technique, gardening, for making an enemy encrypt words you choose. And we have a wartime rule, written down, that kept the American press off the deception table, which is exactly why the Soviets trusted it. A channel the other side believes is clean is the one channel worth abusing. The saucer wasn't built yet, but every tool you'd need to build one was already on the bench, and the people holding those tools were very, very good at their jobs.
This is the uncomfortable center of the whole series, and we reach it in the very first hour, so you are never able to say you weren't warned. Deception, in this story, is not a theory. It is a profession with a literature, a doctrine, and a payroll. The question the season asks is never whether these people existed. They existed. The question is where they were standing when the saucer stories were made. And there is one more thing on that workbench in the 1940s. The thing that turns gardening from a Pacific battle trick into a reason to do it at home. Somewhere in the Soviet cipher system was a flaw. The unbreakable part of their code depended on one-time pads, pages of random numbers used once and destroyed. Used correctly, they are mathematically unbreakable. But under wartime pressure, a Soviet printing plant had duplicated pages. Some pads were used more than once, and that error, that small human industrial mistake, was a door. American codebreakers had found it, and a long, secret effort to walk through it was beginning. History would eventually call it Venona, but the door was closing. Every month, the Soviets came closer to fixing their procedures. If you were an American codebreaker in 1946, you knew you were in a race, and that anything which forced the Soviets to encrypt words you already knew would be worth more than gold. Anything that got known plain text onto their cipher circuits. Anything you could plant. A striking claim, for instance, splashed across the American wire services. A claim that every foreign embassy in Washington would feel obligated to cable home. We are 1 year away from the first flying saucer, and the machine is warm. Let us come back up to the surface and to the present and be clear about what this series is and what it is not. This is not a show that will tell you there is nothing in the sky. People see things they cannot explain. Some of those things are genuinely unexplained. That is an honest position, and we hold it. This show makes a narrower claim and a better documented one. It claims that the story we were handed about what is in the sky was, at key moments, made by human beings, and that we can prove it, name them, and read their paperwork. Over the next 11 episodes, we are going to walk the thread forward, in order, decade by decade. In 1947, we will watch the modern flying saucer arrive in the same summer that American codebreakers most needed the Soviets to encrypt some known words. And we will test and partly refute the idea that those two facts are connected. We will stand at the edge of a Washington highway in 1947, where two intelligence officers died carrying fragments from a hoax a man had already confessed to. We will sit on the board of America's most respected UFO organization in 1957 and count the spies. A psychological warfare specialist who briefed the director of the CIA, the first director of the CIA himself, the founding chief of the agency's psychological warfare staff, saying nothing for 12 years until the day he called the meeting that ended it. We will go to New Mexico in the 1980s and watch the Air Force's own investigators drive a man insane with a fairy tale about aliens, and then confess to it, on the record, at a UFO conference. We will follow a set of forged documents as they are assembled from a novel, laundered through a cleared contractor, and installed as scripture. And we will arrive, at last, back here, in the disclosure era, with its billionaires and its senators and its newspaper of record, and you will recognize every move because you will have watched it perform for 75 years by people who did it better.
I don't need you to believe me. That's the whole point. I want to hand you the pattern, seed, amplify, manage, harvest, and then get out of the way. Once you can see it, you'll do the work yourself. You'll watch the next bombshell land, and you'll ask the only question that has ever mattered in this subject. Not, is it real? Who benefits from me believing it?
Who benefits? That is the thread. In 1897, it was a stringer with a dying town to sell. We are about to meet people with a great deal more to gain and a much better machine to gain it with. Because a war was ending, and an office in the Pentagon whose entire purpose was to deceive the enemy in wartime had written itself a memo. A memo that said its work should continue, in peacetime, in a reduced degree. They kept the machine. Next time, we find out what they pointed it at.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. Remember, we don't teach you what to believe, we teach you how to think. This is the Circle Jerk.